All right, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here in Quebec City. Thank you to Cyril and the conference organizers for having me here. And I just can't help but reflect on the last time I spoke at a Cyril Environment in the Courtroom Symposia was in 2014, February 2014 in Halifax. And as I spoke, the Canadian men's hockey team was playing the United States in the semifinals to decide who would advance to the gold medal game. So needless to say, both the speaker and the audience was distracted. So here we find ourselves 4 years later, and what a difference it makes, because this time we're all, I think, pretty hyper-focused on the topic at hand. Nobody's distracted from this issue of carbon pricing. It is instead dominating the media and dominating conversations in the way that that game may have 4 years ago. But of course, the stakes are much higher here, and so this is a conversation of great importance. So I am, as Elle said, going to look at both BC and Alberta's approach to carbon pricing. And the program works, not surprisingly, beautifully. It's been all carefully coordinated, so it's great to talk after the presentations about the Quebec cap-and-trade system. The reason I'm going to look at both of these systems together is, well, there's three reasons, really. First, each of these jurisdictions are carbon pricing leaders in their own right. I mean, many people don't know that Alberta actually was the first in North America to introduce a carbon pricing mechanism, the precursor to our current output-based allocation system, into the economy. So Professor Lucas is going to tell you more about that tomorrow, as I understand it. And then in the following year, BC introduced North America's first carbon or revenue-neutral carbon tax, and one wonders if they were introducing that today, whether they might call it a legislative regime affecting carbon with some incentives or something else, given the way we're dancing around the word tax right now. But in any event, they introduced this comprehensive carbon tax, which has gained that jurisdiction recognition globally for its leadership on climate change. The second reason I think it's useful to look at these two jurisdictions is that they've each had an impact on the way the pan-Canadian carbon price has rolled out. First of all, they are recognized, each of them, as one of two alternative methods to implement an explicit carbon price in the pan-Canadian carbon pricing benchmark. The coverage of the carbon pricing mechanism in order to satisfy the benchmark is based on British Columbia. It must, each jurisdiction who tries to develop their own scheme must, at a minimum, cover those emission sources or substantially the same emission sources as British Columbia. And then, of course, Alberta's system, its hybrid system, has very much informed what the backstop looks like. So in each of those ways, these two jurisdictions have played an important role in what is developing as the Canadian picture on carbon price. And then finally, I would just say the ambition and effectiveness of all jurisdictions' carbon prices, of course, matter if Canada is going to meet its Paris commitments. But in each of BC and Alberta, there's significant fossil fuel resources. Just weeks ago, LNG Canada announced its final investment decision to proceed in British Columbia with significant consequences for the emissions profile of that province and of this country. And right now, the joint panel into Teck Resources' New Frontier oil sands mine is proceeding in Fort McMurray, largest oil sands project proposed so far, with consequential impacts for both Alberta and Canada's emissions profiles, and therefore its ability to meet its Paris Agreement commitments. So the effectiveness and ambition of each of these carbon pricing schemes are therefore important for all of us. Okay, so this is what I plan to do today. Just sketch briefly BC and Alberta's emissions profiles, give you a quick overview of what those two systems look like, what each system covers, which emissions they cover, what the price looks like, compliance options, and what flexibility is being built into these carbon pricing mechanisms for emission-intensive trade-exposed industry. And then I'll just offer a few concluding thoughts. So I'll just start. This morning we've seen and heard more about Canada's emissions trends, both through to 2016, which this graph provides, and then beyond. And Helene, Professor Trudeau showed us this same slide focusing on Quebec earlier for the emissions by province. And I think when you look at this breakdown of emissions by province, one province really jumps out at us, and that is Alberta, particularly knowing as we do that there's a much smaller population in Alberta than in either Ontario or Quebec. So it's hard not to compare those emissions profiles. If we just break those down a bit, each jurisdiction's emissions profiles by Canadian economic sector, you'll see that transportation occupies a big percentage of British Columbia's emissions. Close to 40% of their emissions are associated with transportation. The next highest emissions come from oil and gas. They, like Quebec, have the true luxury of having a very clean, decarbonized electricity sector, 0.2%. And so it's logical to focus on transportation, and then also to keep in mind that emissions tranche there associated with oil and gas, and recognize the potential for that to grow, given, again, that large natural gas resource that is on the cusp of being developed through the LNG sector more fully. If we switch to Alberta, though, you'll see the emissions profile is very different. So almost 50% of Alberta's emissions reported in 2016 come from oil and gas. The next largest emission source is electricity, and that's as a result of our heavy reliance on coal-fired power, which is one of the things that the Alberta government is working now on phasing out, funded by the carbon price. So one of those complementary policies working alongside the carbon price that will have an important impact on Alberta's emissions profiles. So when we put them together, because on these charts, it looks like there's somehow an equivalent in volume. BC's in blue. I couldn't resist putting Alberta in orange. But you can see that there are some really very, very significant differences in our emissions profiles. And I think that what this helps drive home is when we talk about a uniform carbon price and different systems delivering a carbon price, the carbon price has to work for the particular emissions profile of the jurisdiction. And although it seems like when we're talking about a tax and a levy, we're talking about apples to apples, maybe a different kind of apple, maybe a Macintosh and a GLA, but instead of apples to orange like the cap and trade to a fixed carbon price system, we have to dig a little bit deeper to understand, in light of the emissions profiles of the jurisdiction, whether the carbon tax is actually doing the work that we are expecting it to. Okay. In brief overview then of these systems, obviously we could say a lot more about each of them, but all of you in the room know, I think, that BC has an explicit price carbon tax. And what that carbon tax does is impose a direct price on each ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that results from the combustion of fossil fuel and the burning of tires for energy. And they spell it that way in their regs, so spell tires that way. So it's very much a combustion-based tax. It does not attach to non-combustion emissions. There's a second potential carbon pricing mechanism in British Columbia, and it's interesting just picking up on the conversation and the questions in the last session. British Columbia at least was, I'm not sure if they still are, a member of the Western Climate Initiative as well. And they went so far as passing cap-and-trade legislation. The intention was that cap-and-trade legislation would operate alongside the carbon tax. That legislation, though, was never proclaimed, and in 2014 it was repealed, with the Minister for the Environment saying at that time that cap-and-trade hadn't proceeded as they had expected, and that emissions pricing was going slower in other jurisdictions than expected. So instead, they repealed that legislation and they replaced it with this legislation called the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act. It contains the mechanisms to report emissions, but it also has the capacity to put in place emission intensity-based baselines. Not a cap like the cap-and-trade system, not a cap on industrial emissions or sectors of industry, but rather the ability to go industry by industry or sector by sector with an emissions intensity limit. To date, there is one. That's an emission intensity limit for liquefied natural gas operations. All of the LNG projects for which either financing has been confirmed, like LNG Canada, or for which approval has already been granted, fall under this baseline, and so it won't affect those operations. But over the baseline, it works much like the Alberta output-based allowance system, and much like the backstop system for large emitters under the federal program. Okay, over to Alberta then. Alberta has a carbon levy. It took effect in January 2017, and it works essentially the same as the British Columbia carbon tax. It focuses on combustion emissions associated with fossil fuel. But operating alongside our carbon levy is an output-based allocation system enacted under the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation. And what this regulation does is create competition across sectors to incentivize emissions intensity reductions by applying product-based benchmarks. So these benchmarks apply to products, bitumen, for example, electricity, for example, and they set for those products an emission intensity on the basis of unit of product produced. So they don't cap emissions. They instead set a benchmark to which industry who's subject to a benchmark should strive with respect to emissions intensity. So there's no cap on production. Emissions can grow and these benchmarks can still be met. But the economy should become less emission intensive and therefore more efficient in its use of GHGs as a result of this system. In 2020, those benchmarks are going to start tightening by 1% a year, and so there'll be a slow, gradual ratcheting down of emissions intensity. The baselines that have been set vary. So for bitumen, it's based on the top quartile producers. So draw a line at the top quartile producers' emission intensity. Anything above that exceeds the benchmark. For electricity, it's good as best gas, so that coal-fired power stations well exceed the benchmark. Okay, so different benchmarks for different products. Okay, coverage then, what's in? Well, as I've said, the BC carbon tax applies to the combustion of fossil fuels. It has some exclusions: interjurisdictional travel, fuel used by eligible First Nations, farming, fuel used for farming purposes, any fuel that's not combusted. Those things aren't covered by the BC carbon tax. Otherwise, all combustion emissions are in. But what's out is non-combustion emissions, those associated with agriculture, landfills, forestry, industry, natural gas production. So process emissions, venting, fugitive emissions, those aren't captured. Altogether, this covers right now approximately 70% of the BC economy. What's interesting to note is when this carbon tax was first brought in, it covered 77% of the BC economy. But what's happening is fuel-based combustion emissions are either remaining, they're relatively stable. They dropped for a while. They began to increase again. But what's changing disproportionately is the amount of fugitive emissions associated with LNG, or not LNG, associated with natural gas production, the fracking boom. So proportionately, the coverage has fallen. At the time, the decision was made to leave certain emission sources outside the BC carbon pricing system, like fugitive emissions, because they couldn't be accurately measured. And you can't price what you can't measure. But our capacity to measure these things has grown. And so commentators like the Pembina Institute say that if the BC carbon tax was updated to include emissions that could be measured, those vented and fugitive emissions that could be measured, they could cover 80% of their economy. But right now, it's about 70% of the economy. Okay, well, what about next door in Alberta? In Alberta, again, the carbon levy applies to the same kind of things that the BC carbon tax applies to. Similar exemptions, except for one special little added exclusion for natural gas consumed in the process of the production of conventional oil and gas. But what's important is, asterisk, any facilities covered by the output-based allocation system are exempt from the carbon levy, okay? Because they instead get shuffled into the Alberta's output-based system. Any industry or facility with annual emissions of 100,000 tons of CO2 equivalent or higher are automatically captured by Alberta's OBA system. Okay. Outside of the pricing system completely are some non-combustion emissions that come from facilities that don't have emissions of over 100,000 tons CO2 equivalent a year, unless they opt in, or agriculture, forestry, etc. So right now, in combination, just like BC, Alberta is covering about 70% of their emissions. But 50% of that coverage comes from our output-based allocation system, and that's an important fact to remember as we talk about what price looks like under these systems and what the compliance options look like under these systems. BC carbon tax, very straightforward, dollar price per ton of carbon. Started in 2008 at $10 a ton per CO2 equivalent, rose by $5 every year till it got to $30 in 2012, and then it was stuck there for 6 years. Lots of studies said that initially this was causing emissions to fall. And then the longer the price sat at $30, people behaviorally adjusted, apparently, to that price change, and emissions again began to rise. April 2018, we saw our first increase by $5, so it's now at $35 a ton, increasing by $5 a year until getting to $50 a ton, 1 year in advance of the Pan-Canadian benchmark, which requires $50 a ton by 2022. Okay. Oh, and that shouldn't be the equivalent of that is wrong. Oh yeah, the equivalent of, that should be 7.78, yes it is, 7.78 cents. I thought it was $7, that's wrong. 7.78 cents per liter of gasoline, that's the current carbon tax in British Columbia. Over in Alberta, carbon levy started last January at $20 a ton. It rose to $30 a ton January of this year. That's $6.73 cents per liter of gasoline. The output-based allocation system, unlike the carbon levy or the carbon tax, though, has no explicit carbon price and no explicit floor price. Rather, what it has is a whole bunch of compliance options, one of which is payment of $30 a ton into a fund. So that $30 a ton is the ceiling price, because you would never, presumably, choose as a sort of rational actor in the economic modeling, choose to do something that's going to be more expensive if you have the option of paying $30 a ton. So that sets a price on the cost of compliance. Other compliance mechanisms, offsets produced in Alberta only, or the purchase of emission performance credits are set by the market. But again, there's not a market incentive to pay $40 for an offset when you can pay $30 into the fund for compliance. Okay, this is connected to the previous slide, those compliance options. BC carbon tax, again, is super simple. Either use less fossil fuels or pay the carbon price. Same goes for the carbon levy in Alberta. Change your behavior is the messaging. Under Alberta's OBA, though, as I've just said, we're working on these benchmarks. So first of all, if you're below the benchmark, you receive free environmental performance credits. Okay, so some oil sands producers, for example, will be given free environmental performance credits under the OBA system. If you're a covered facility that's exceeding the benchmark, then you can reduce your emissions intensity to come below that benchmark. You can buy those performance credits from the other exemplary producers in the secondary market. You can buy offsets in the secondary market, or again, you can pay into the fund. And importantly, there's no limit. There's a limit on offsets credits and the emission performance credits, but there's no limit on how much can be paid into the fund at a fixed rate. So that means that every member of the covered sector, every large emitter in the province, could bring themselves into compliance with no change in emissions intensity under the OBA Act, but the generation of a significant amount of revenue through the fund. Oh, and then that last asterisk, the one other thing to remember when we're thinking about carbon price, when we say Alberta has a $30 a ton carbon price, half of our economy, our largest emitters, are operating under this OBA system, and only those emissions that are above the emissions intensity benchmark attract the carbon price. Okay, so that's very different from combustion emissions in BC, and it's very different under a cap and trade, where although some of those emissions may be given, there might be a free allocation of permits, every ton of carbon attracts the carbon price. So for this reason, the OBA system, economic commentators are happy to recognize, the OBA system is a subsidy. It subsidizes all those emissions below the benchmark. And the justification in Alberta for drawing the line and saying everybody with 100,000 tons or more of CO2 equivalent, in you go to the OBA system, is that they, and this is the languaging from the Alberta Climate Leadership Report, they tend to be emission-intensive trade exposed. Okay, they tend to be emission-intensive trade exposed, so that puts them into this basket. Okay, then let's just deal with that last emission-intensive trade exposed compliance flexibility question. So of course we're concerned about carbon leakage, right? That's why there's this concern about emission intensity trade exposed industry being exposed to a carbon price when their competitors aren't, with the rationale being because then they pick up, they move somewhere else, the economy suffers, and there's no gain for the climate. BC, trade exposure is very low. This study I cite says about 2%, others say 5%, but it's very low trade exposure. However, those studies say should the LNG sector grow, that sector would likely be quite exposed to trade competitiveness. So historically, BC's carbon tax has made very few exemptions beyond, the farmers and the First Nations and interprovincial travel. It's applied to the combustion of all fossil fuels. And that's easier to do because there's very little trade exposure. The cement industry has received some temporary support, greenhouse growers some support as well, but a pretty flat tax, which is why economists think it's like a textbook example of the kind of carbon tax they imagined when they started pushing this idea of carbon pricing. But there's a little chink in the BC armor as far as the flatness of their tax, and that is in the most recent BC budget, there was a proposal to create a new clean growth incentive program for large industrial emitters. And that proposal will establish a benchmark, and the benchmark is the lowest emitting facility operating anywhere in the world, so a stringent benchmark. But eligible facilities who are there, who become the best in the world, the proposal is that they will receive a rebate on their carbon tax above $30. So as the carbon tax grows, there'll be this potential for best performers to receive this accommodation. And it's particularly talked about in the context of the LNG projects that are moving forward. In Alberta, way more trade exposure. About close to 20% of the economy is exposed, emission intensive and trade exposed. So again, the OBA system is itself a nod to that because it is a subsidy on the carbon price. It exposes on a cost-weighted total per ton price emitters to much lower price than would be the case under another system. Further concessions or accommodations are also provided in the Alberta system. If the whole sector is at risk of carbon leakage, the benchmark can be further reduced. And as of 2018, there's a cost containment program to provide more relief to trade-exposed facilities that are likely to experience economic hardship attributable to incremental compliance costs. And then finally, for those facilities that are below 100,000 tons, there's opt-in provisions if they're 50,000 tons or more, provided they meet certain criteria, one of which is that they're trade exposed. So it's another way of helping trade-exposed industries that are have a little smaller emissions than the bar set by the OBA system. And the fact that there's this opt-in provision is your clue that it's better to be in than to be out, right? It's better to be in this carbon pricing system than to be out. Okay, just some concluding thoughts. So where does that leave us when we have these side-by-side comparisons? Well, we could say currently BC has a $35 a ton $35 per ton of CO2 equivalent carbon price, and Alberta has a $30 per ton CO2 equivalent carbon price. But that's not nuanced enough, I would suggest. Rather, we should say BC has a $35 per ton carbon price on combustion emissions. Non-combustion emissions are not priced. And it's showing signs of subsidizing combustion emissions for these large new emission-intensive entrants into the economy. Alberta, meanwhile, I would say, has a carbon price of $30 per ton on combustion emissions. However, for 50% of the economy, the most emission-intensive portion of the economy, the price is capped at $30 a ton. And that capped price applies only to those emissions that exceed the benchmark. And while exposed and incentivizing, the economists tell us, while still incentivizing emission intensity reductions with the benefit of selling any credits that are generated, only those emissions above the benchmark are actually priced, and the rest that fall below the benchmark are subsidized. So, just to conclude, the big challenge then for the federal government, well, as they're fighting off constitutional challenges and trying to impose the backstop, the carbon pricing backstop, on those economies that haven't been proactive and put in place their own pricing mechanisms. The other big challenge, I think, is to make these different instruments, these different existing carbon pricing mechanisms talk to each other. And there was questions about how does the cap and trade work compared to the backstop or these other pricing systems. And in the benchmark document, the government does talk about that, about how they're going to go forward and try and achieve equivalency in effectiveness. And one of the first cabs off the rank, and one of the most important, in my opinion, is the commitment to undertake a close review of how emission-intensive trade-exposed industries are treated under the carbon pricing benchmark, and to consider what is best practice in addressing this particular issue. And if we don't do that, if we just talk about a capped price as the carbon price, or we just talk about BC's carbon tax as a whole of economy carbon price and don't recognize it doesn't apply to all emissions, and particularly non-combustion emissions, then we risk undermining the ambition and the stringency of the carbon price that I think we are working towards in order to meet our Paris commitments. So that's all. Thank you very much.